So welcome. This is the last. I think we're promoting this as our Power Friday. We've got 2 leadership forums today. This first with Dr. Denson, and the second one at. I thought you'd get a kick out of that.
I do get a kick out of that.
At 11 o'clock with Dr. Magalit, both distinguished alumni of this university and honorary doctorate recipients. So it's a great pleasure. Thanks all for coming. So as usual, I'm going to dispense with the bio. You have those on your chairs. Charlie, thanks for making the trip. I think we've got a full day for you. You had breakfast with some students this morning, and then we've got lunch with some of our sports marketing students later on. So let's, if we can, please welcome former president of Nike brand and one of the great alumni of this university, Charlie Denson. So Charlie, we all know you from Nike, but currently you're chairman of Teneo Sports.
Teneo, right.
Teneo Sports. Right. So I've done lots of Googling, because that's where we get all of our information these days, and I can't still for the life of me understand what Teneo is.
Perfect.
So tell us what that is and what's your role as chairman.
Actually, the group, the Teneo group, is a group that was started by 3 guys, all out of the Clinton administration. And if any of you followed some of the more recent coverage of the campaign, a guy named Doug Band, who is one of the principals at Teneo, was identified as in the email stream, one of Hillary's email streams. And Doug actually worked with President Clinton for about 25 years as his personal assistant and advisor. And Doug was actually the one that started the Clinton Global Initiative and ran it for the first 4 years. And then he finally left and started Teneo with another guy named Declan Kelly, who is an Irishman from and was Hillary's emissary to Ireland when she was Secretary of State. So pretty deep ties back to the Clinton administration. And a friend of mine who had worked at Nike for 14, 15 years and had done all of our government affairs in D.C., had worked with Doug in the Oval Office during President Clinton's tenure. And he had left Nike and gone to work with Doug and Declan and the team. And when I retired, enticed me into a meeting with these guys, which I really had no intent of doing anything but having a cup of coffee. But they are very dynamic and kind of laid out an opportunity to add to they are a consulting firm that is a little bit unique in a sense that their target market is really Fortune 100 CEOs. And so basically, instead of the traditional consulting profile, which is more capability and silo-driven, they look at the CEO role and how to help a CEO of a major global corporation navigate it horizontally as opposed to vertically, is really kind of the way they describe themselves. And so they had engaged in quite a few discussions over the first couple years of the development of the company, that the sports conversation would come up fairly regularly, and they really didn't have anybody of consequence, in the firm that could represent, point of view from a sports standpoint. So we created a business plan, and they talked me into serving as a chairman, which I spend probably a day or 2 a week with the team. We now have a CEO, and we have teams. We have offices in Atlanta, New York, London, Dublin, and are in the process of probably putting one somewhere in the Middle East, probably in Dubai. And really, we had talked a lot about doing athlete business development and management. what has really taken off is the corporate side of the business, and so we've really focused on that, and working with companies like Coke and McDonald's, Samsung, and things like that on their sports marketing portfolios. So that's
Yeah.
and the bigger Teneo is really focused on government affairs, a lot of crisis management, activist shareholder work, things like that. So that's what it is.
So let me ask you a couple questions on that. This forum is about leadership. So you just said you hired your CEO, and you're hiring a team. What sort of qualities are you looking for when you?
Well, we had originally looked for a CEO, basically a high-profile individual that would bring, both recognition and a Rolodex, so to speak, to the role. I think what became a necessity, and I always kid these guys because they're consultants, and I have never been a consultant, and I always give them a bad time. My line to them is, hey, I've spent the last 30 years throwing guys like you out of my office, so I'm not going to be the right guy to go sit in some CEO's office and tell them how much they need me to do it. And so what we finally ended up doing was pulling in somebody who was currently at the firm, who had run Accenture North America for about 25 years, and was a bit of a sports fan anyway. And we pulled him in because he's a consultant. He's a professional consultant, and he's been fantastic. And so it really complements what I bring to the table.
Yeah.
He doesn't have the sports background that I have. I don't have the consulting background that he has, and so actually it's turned out to be a really good partnership.
Great. So one of the things that I'd read about Teneo Sports is that you've got the corporate clients, but you also represent in some ways. I mean, that's probably not the right verb, but work with athletes. And so are you bringing the two together in some way?
Yeah, what the initial idea or concept was, so when I left Nike, one of the things that I saw on a daily basis was, a lot of the high-profile athletes really didn't understand the opportunity that they had from a business development standpoint. And most of them were engaged mostly in sponsorship or, hawking products or whatever, and really not thinking about a bigger picture, bigger idea about developing businesses. And obviously the best example is Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
And the Jordan brand now does about $3 billion a year in business. And so Michael gets a nice little cut of that, which exceeds any sponsorship agreement he could have ever dreamed of, and represents a very high percentage of his wealth and net worth at this point in time. But and I think probably the best current example of somebody who really gets it and understands it and has done a fantastic job is LeBron. And so LeBron and his business manager, business partner, a kid named Maverick Carter, LeBron doesn't do that many endorsements anymore. He really only takes on endorsements where he has a piece of the company and that he can actually provide a complementary piece of the puzzle, which is exposure, but then he enjoys, obviously, the fruits and benefits of that growth from an ownership standpoint. And so the idea was to build those types of portfolios for athletes. And I think we'll still do that. The corporate side of the business has taken off, so we've really kind of shifted our focus to the corporate side right now, and I think we'll come back to that when the time is appropriate and the resource base is there to do it.
Yeah, that's great. So I think most of the people here want to talk about Nike. I want to get to that, but I want to talk about the Denson Feed and Seed store in Corvallis. So when did you work there? And
Corporate America.
That's right. The heart of corporate America, Corvallis.
Corvallis. No, Corvallis is actually very similar to Logan. It's a college town, State University, Oregon State's there, ag school. I was telling the group earlier, when I came to Utah State, it was very familiar because I grew up in literally a town, a community just like Logan. So for me, it was a fairly easy transition. But no, it was a family business, and so that was my retail background.
Yeah.
And in fact, my brother who owned it, he's third generation. The business was around for 83 years, and my brother finally retired and sold the business last year, and now is developing some of the real estate that the business sat on. But that was my. I started.
When did you start working there?
12, I think, was when I got my first initial exposure.
Sell and feed.
Well, my job title was warehouse broomsman, actually, was what I did. I was in charge of making sure that the warehouse was clean.
So, and what lessons did you learn there about work?
That I better do what my dad said. Even though I couldn't get fired, I think I probably got fired quite a few times. But no, I think I would say the thing that I learned probably in those early days was understanding a consumer relationship.
Yeah.
And even at that level where somebody came in and they could have gone to other places to buy whatever they were looking to buy in town, but they came because of the relationship they had with originally my granddad, my dad, and then ultimately my brother.
Yeah.
And the consumer relationship was really probably the part that still sticks with me today.
So from there, you came to Utah State to play football. We often hear from employers about a bias for hiring athletes. Did you see that through your career? Have you seen that? And what do you think it is that makes student athletes attractive for employers?
Well, I think the good and bad, right? So the athlete does come with a stigma attached to it sometimes, which can be a positive or a negative. I think I work for a sports company, so it was a stigma that was embraced in that regard. And but I think probably the two things that stand out are competitiveness and teamwork. Yeah. And obviously there's not a lot of teamwork in some of the individual sports, but even as a tennis player, a golfer, or you have to have a team behind you. Yeah. To really get to your full potential. And so I think those two qualities come out of that world of sports that are truly transferable, especially into the world of business, and provide a base layer of competency and capability would be.
And those qualities are something anyone can learn to develop. It doesn't have to be
Yeah,
athletes.
no, I mean for sure. I think you don't have to play football to be competitive.
Yeah.
I think some of the most competitive people in the world are definitely not athletes. Yeah. We saw that in the latest political campaigning season. So
We'll try to stay away from that topic. It's still touchy for some people in this audience.
yeah,
I can pick them out. I can see them.
it's okay.
So after USU, returned to Oregon to begin your career with Nike as an assistant store manager at Nike's first retail store in 1979. So what was Nike like in 1979?
Well, it was a private company, so small company. I think global revenues for 1978, the year before I started mid-year in the fiscal year. So I think the global revenues were like $75 million for the year. So small company. I think my original employee number was 103, and it was very familial, and it was very informal. It certainly didn't have even the precursor environment of what a global corporation looks like today. Every Friday everybody met at the office for beers and talked about what happened during the week and what was working, what wasn't working, what was exciting and coming and new, and what the latest sports landscape looked like and things like that. So it was a very comfortable atmosphere, and quite frankly, one that I thought at the time was temporary for me personally. You come out of school and you're you're kind of ready to go and got to get started in your career. And I told the story earlier. I had a very close friend of mine that I grew up with who had run track at University of Oregon, of which 90% of the employees at the time were University of Oregon track athlete alumni because of Phil and Bill Bowerman. And he had offered me a job in the retail stores right out of school. And I said, no, I got to get going on my career. That's just a bunch of jocks screwing around. That's not a real job or a real career, a real company. And so I went to work for a department store in an executive training program and did that for about 5-6 months and got through the holiday season and went, boy, this sucks. This is no fun. This isn't what I want to do for my career. And so we ran into each other again during the holidays, and he said, well, you ought to come, you can still come. And I said, so I went up and I interviewed and I met a bunch of the people and I said, okay, I'll do this for a couple of years and then I'll go get a real job. And I was very fortunate to be in a position where I never had to go get a real job. So it worked out okay.
Yeah, worked out okay. So from that store to president of Nike brand, lots of different, can you show us through that?
It happened about that quick.
Yeah, about that quick. 34 years, like that.
No, I think, I started in the stores, which was great because the contact point was the consumer. And the thing, even as president of the brand and running a global operation, the thing that we still emphasized was the relationship with the consumer. And that really was what we served, was that relationship. And that was in running a global operation, it is complicated, sophisticated, chaotic, challenging, and has an incredible portfolio of diverse issues, problems, challenges, et cetera, and opportunities. And so, trying to get an entire workforce focused on one single thing can provide a great touchstone at points of indecision. And so what we always culturally tried to do was keep everybody focused on what would the consumer say, what would the consumer want, what would the consumer, need, desire, and in some cases, the consumer doesn't know what they don't know.
Yeah.
And so, how do you make sure that any new ideas or new concepts or things are going to be embraced by the consumer? And so that was another piece of the puzzle, was how do you embrace the consumer and get them to embrace new ideas? Sometimes it doesn't work, not always easy.
Yeah.
Sometimes ideas kind of come before their time in some cases, or aren't introduced in the right way. And but it was always about the consumer. And so I think, for us as a company, keeping everybody focused on that first, which is a relatively simple concept to get your head around, whether you're, living in Shanghai, China, or Sao Paulo, Brazil, or, Allentown, Pennsylvania. We could keep everybody on that page. And that was an important part of it.
So that was one of the things I was going to ask you. You led the expansion into China and India and Brazil. So what did you find? So that focus on the consumer, what was it that ties all of us as maybe sports fans together around the world? And what are some of the cultural differences as you focus on the consumer that were different in Brazil versus?
Yeah. Well, part of it was obviously how you communicate with the consumer.
Yeah.
So we were talking about it earlier this morning about, the different cultural innuendos that as an American I might not have understood because I didn't grow up in Sao Paulo or I didn't grow up in Beijing or whatever. And allowing our teams to be creative and embrace those local understandings and relationships was a big part of the local success. The other thing that we found as we continued to expand around the world was that our first point of entry with most of the emerging market consumers were that we were an American brand, not a sports brand. not a fashion brand, not a lifestyle brand, an American brand. And so there's a huge appetite, for that American brand allegiance or connection with the emerging marketplace.
Yeah.
America stands for, what they are trying to achieve from so many economically, socially, et cetera, et cetera. So the first thing we always had to do was go in and establish ourselves. No, we're a sports brand more than we are just an American brand. And so there was a period of time where that focus was really the initial entree into a marketplace. It was trying to develop ourselves with the credibility that we could really leverage all the things that we were doing and utilize strategies globally. But what worked in the United States, which was a market that was developed from 1972 until the year 2000, didn't always work when you went into India or you went into China or you went into Brazil. And so you had to stage some of the development of the brand building exercise depending on where you were as a brand in each of the different marketplaces. That gets easier and easier and easier as we progress because the world's communication technologies are allowing that to happen now on a much, much faster and quite frankly more consistent basis. So that what they do today, if I were to go into a marketplace today, it would be a much different set of strategies than when we went into a marketplace 15 years ago.
Yeah, that's great. So let me talk about that. Last time you were here, about 3 years ago, you talked about some of that transition from marketing on television to marketing online. So I grew up on the Nike commercials. We talked about that.
Yeah.
So show of hands. I know John Hartwell will know the answer. Show of hands. Who here knows who Mars Blackman is? Wow. I think there's like 2 or 3 hands of people under 25. That's amazing. John, you know who Mars Blackman is? Do you remember those commercials? Yeah. You don't do that anymore, right? So
how many people know who Spike Lee is? Oh, okay. Spike Lee played Mars Blackman.
So the first commercials I remember, black and white, in black and white, Spike Lee playing this character Mars Blackman and Michael Jordan. And that's when really Jordan and Nike just blew up. And they were on TV all the time. And then some years later, no more Nike commercials on TV. And I wondered what the hell happened to that. Those were great, but they're all online. So how did that change? And what did you find that worked better? Some of the opportunities and challenges moving from essentially a push medium, right, in marketing to this online.
Yeah, I think, well, for us, we were, from a communication standpoint, marketing and communication, advertising, we were kind of on the forefront of that transition for several reasons. One, our target consumer was 15 years old. So if you were marketing bank services or airlines or basically 80% of all consumer transactions that purchasing decision is not held by the 15-year-old. And so ours was. And so the reason that we were on the cutting edge of that transition is because our target consumer started to shift. And they weren't spending as much time in front of the TV as my generation when they were 15. So now I have a 15-year-old who's hardly even, the only thing he knows how to work about a TV is how to get his game console going. But but I think so we saw that from a consumer, it was a consumer-led transition for us. And we started migrating our spend off of analog platforms onto digital platforms. And then obviously with the introduction of the social media concept and the social media platforms that started clear back with God, now I'm starting to show my age. The Murdoch bought it. What was the pre-Facebook
Oh, yeah.
platform? We can't even remember what it is.
MySpace.
Yeah. Murdoch bought it, tried to turn it into an analog platform, and it failed. But we started to see that migration, and so you started to see fewer and fewer communication platforms, i.e., brand campaigns that were launched over analog TV. Today, you'll still see them, but you'll see them at global events, Olympics. We even left the Super Bowl 15 years ago. Very, very rarely, but it's usually where you're trying to get a very, very broad-based level of psych and demographic penetration, but because the online experience is so much more personalized and customized, that it represents a significantly higher spend percentage today. And the other thing that you learn is that that's a two-way medium, which the younger generation, it's a non-negotiable. If you're not communicating in a two-way medium, then quite frankly, you're just not heard, because it gets tuned out, or it doesn't even get seen, quite frankly.
So one last question from me before we have our students participate. So last time, I wanted to ask you about this. Last time you also spoke about the importance of being in the game, and you shared the experience right after Tiger Woods' personal life blew up. And your first thought was that as a sponsor most tied with Tiger, Nike couldn't just not address that in some way. And so you helped craft a really powerful ad, but you had some back and forth with Phil Knight, your boss at the time, about whether Nike should do that or not. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, so Tiger was obviously, at the peak of his game, so to speak, and I think, and probably retrospectively, maybe even at his career, and obviously, I think it was a great learning experience and about transparency, and in today's world, if you're gonna not be real, you're gonna get exposed. And I think, and again, going back to that consumer perspective, I think for the younger consumer, it's almost intuitive. You can almost, they almost have an intuition about what's real and what's not. And I think you guys represent, that group in a very powerful way. And I think so. So when that happened, we had to take on that situation, and so there was several layers of decision making that had to go on. Do we stick with him? Do we not stick with him? Do we cut the relationship? Okay, we decided we didn't want to do that. So we say, okay, how are we going to address this? And we couldn't be in a situation where we didn't take it head on, because we felt very strongly about the need for transparency in our relationship with him and his connection back to the brand. And so the ad agency and the marketing group, they really struggled to come up with a concept. And I still remember this like it was yesterday. I was in Shanghai, and I got a call at about 10 o'clock at night Shanghai time, which is like 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 1 o'clock in the afternoon or whatever, Beaverton time. And the deadline was the next day to have, if we were going to have an ad ready for the Masters, which was in about 10 days. And Tiger was going to play in it. And it was the first time he was going to play in the Masters since all this had boiled over. And so we were up against the deadline. And they said, we can't get a concept that he feels comfortable with, that we feel comfortable with, that will work. And we said, okay, well then you better go back to work, because we can't go to the Masters without having a point of view. It's just, we told the ad group, it's just non-negotiable. We have to have a point of view. And so I got a call at literally about 4:30 in the morning. and they said, I think we have a concept that's going to work. And so I had to call the China guys, and we were staying in a hotel literally right across from where the office was. We had to call them about 6 o'clock in the morning. We said, we need to get into the office. We need to get to the video equipment so that they can show us the ad. Because at the time we couldn't even get the ad, through like an email or anything like that. We had to do a video link. So I'm literally sitting in the office at 6 o'clock in the morning in Shanghai, and I'm watching this ad, and it's Tiger Woods, and it's his dad, basically admonishing him for his failings in his personal life. And of course, his dad had passed away 2 years earlier. So it was very, very powerful.
It's very real.
And we said, and I personally loved it. And so we said, okay, it was rough. They had to finish it. And so I said, let's go with it. And so we went with it. And then about 3 days later, I got back to Portland, and I get a call from Phil Knight, who had finally seen the ad. And he called me and he says, why don't you come over here? I want to talk to you about this. So I go over to his office and everything, and his office is across campus. And he says, are you nuts? And I said, why? He says, you think this is a good idea? And I said, I do. I think this is really the only way we can address, the situation. And I felt very, very strongly about not addressing it, because I thought basically a situation where we didn't take on a leadership position in how we reacted to the whole thing was going to leave us in a position of non-leadership, which I think for our brand and the relationship that our brand had with the high-profile athletes around the world was kind of a non-negotiable. And so he says, okay. He says, I'll go with it until it doesn't work, and then it's your fault. And sure enough, we went with it, and I walked the course at the Masters with Phil and Tiger's mom. And we had people come up to us nonstop for 4 days and tell us how much they love the ad. So that one turned out okay.
All right. You should go after this and check that ad out on YouTube. If you just do Nike and Tiger Woods, it's an amazingly, incredibly powerful ad. I don't know how you did the voiceover with
Earl.
With Earl already.
Well, fortunately, we had enough tape of Earl that it was available. I mean, he was a very, very interesting man, very smart guy actually, but very dynamic personality in his own right.
Yeah. That's great. All right, so let's have some questions from the audience here. There's one right here in the front.
Staying on the topic of leadership, what things did you learn from Bill Bowerman and working with him and the brand?
Yep, that's a great question. I think Bowerman, I met Bowerman maybe 4 or 5 times. His personality, obviously a cornerstone of the company's culture, along with Knight's. Knight considers him his personal mentor. I think the biggest takeaway I always had with Bowerman was he hated to be called coach. He says, I'm not a coach, I'm a teacher. And he approached his role as coach in the vein of a teacher. And I think his success was built on not only the physical capabilities of the kids that he coached, but really what he got out of them and what he got them to believe in themselves. I mean, there was a book written by one of his early runners named Kenny Moore called The Boys of Oregon, or The Men of Oregon. And it talks about Bowerman and his coaching style and technique and what he did. And I think that transferred to Knight. And I don't know how many of you have read the book Shoe Dog. It's a great book about leadership and entrepreneurialness. And one of the things that Knight talks about in the book is transferring his learnings from Bowerman. And one of the great quotes in the book was, Never underestimate what people think they can do. You know, so many times managers feel like it's their job to tell people what to do. I worked for Knight directly for 14 years. I always tell this story. He never told me what to do, not once. Told me what not to do a couple times. The Tiger Woods ad was pretty close. But he never told me what to do, ever. And so, which really empowered me to believe that I could do whatever I really felt we as a company needed to do. And that was pretty empowering, and I think was another way that he got me to reach beyond maybe what I thought my potential was. So I think that's really, you know, when you talk about leadership and you talk about what are the great components of what makes great leaders, one of them is believing that the people that you're leading can do things they may not believe that they can do themselves.
It's a great question.
But his book it's really good. I think a lot of people are disappointed because they thought it was going to be a tell-all with all the athletes and all the stories. And it's really a fantastically well-written book about entrepreneurialism and leadership.
A question in the back.
So speaking of Shoe Dog, it kind of wraps up when Nike goes public. And I was wondering how you guys, I know one of the big concerns that Phil Knight had was keeping kind of that private company decision-making ability, transitioning that into a public company. So how were you able to negotiate that and transition and keep those kind of the same sort of decision-making process?
Great question. I think, I was very fortunate to be in a position when I was running the brand and the company, so to speak. We were a public company, and we spent a lot of time in the public sector, you know, with Wall Street and the investment community and shareholders and et cetera. And Knight was always very, very specific about his commitment to the shareholders. One of the reasons is because he was the biggest shareholder. But one of the benefits that we had as a public company was the fact that he still controlled 95% of the voting shares. And so we had really the best of both worlds. So, you know, from a leadership management standpoint, I really was in a position where I had the best of both worlds. You had the resources and the exposure and the profile of a Fortune 100 public company, but we still had the opportunity to run it like a private company, which really, I think if you look at the long-term success of the company, that's the reason why. We weren't knocked off of our strategies or our game, so to speak, by the pressures of a quarterly deliverable, which is by far one of the biggest influential forces that affects the public sector today, the public company sector today. And I think if you look at the legendary investor Warren Buffett, one of his strongest profile capabilities in the companies that he invests in is what is their long-term strategies and what are their long-term, capabilities and an opportunity landscape look like. And Warren was a big investor at Nike from the early days, and so we had a regular contact with his group all the time because he was a big believer that because of the way we were structured and that Knight had a vision for what he wanted to do, that we were going to be successful. So we were fortunate.
Right here.
I'll speak loud. Charlie, thank you for taking my question. Question about the Nike brand and the history. I'd like to see if there are 3 pivotal moments that kind of made the brand what it is. Every brand has a birth, in the last 3 to 4 years, what would be 3 of those pivotal moments that kind of established essentially a worldwide trend of what Nike has become now versus what it was when you started and prior?
I think, for Nike, it's easy to pick pivotal moments because you can tie them to athletes. So I think the first pivotal moment was Steve Prefontaine. And for Prefontaine, he was really the first controversial athlete that challenged the system. He was the American record holder from every distance from the mile to the 10,000 meters, which in today's world is almost incomprehensible. But he held the American record at every distance. And so he was a very, very powerful force. When track and field was really on the upswing, and the old AAU and the amateurism in the U.S. was so antiquated, and competing against athletes in Germany and Russia and some of the European countries where they had government subsidies and government jobs and everything that they needed to be able to train full time, and the fact that he to maintain his amateur status, he had to tend bar in Eugene, to pay for his rent in his mobile home in Eugene, and that took away from his training time. So he was very controversial, and Knight took up that charge with him, and so that became one of the very, very initial pivotal positions that the brand embraced of being the voice of the athlete. And today, if you listen to Phil Knight talk and you ask him about the brand, the first thing he will talk about is representing the voice of the athlete. And for him, that was the inspiration for the company and the culture. I think the second one was probably tied to Michael Jordan. And at the time, Michael didn't want to come with Nike, didn't really understand where or what. Michael tells the story himself. He was an Adidas guy from the get-go, and a Converse guy. He wore Converse at North Carolina when he played. He was a big fan of the Adidas, superstar shoe himself from a fashion standpoint, or so to speak. He really didn't understand where Nike came from. I won't go into the story about signing Michael. He didn't want anything to do with it, but his dad convinced him. His dad convinced him because we were going to pay him 5 times more than any of the other guys. And so, as they say, the rest is history. But I think it really turned into the case study on how to amplify the voice of the athlete and turn that voice, into an emotion. You talk about Mars Blackmon, and you talk about some of the legendary Jordan commercials over the years that have become so much intertwined with the brand's emotional connection with consumers. And so I'd say that was probably the second biggest one. And I'd say the third one is really not tied to an athlete, but was tied to a circumstance when all of a sudden we became the poster child for child labor in the Far East. And the fact that we had become the target for it really hurt us, because the last thing we thought we were doing was taking advantage of child labor anywhere in the world. We were spending millions of dollars in our factory base, providing housing, education, better living conditions, paying above minimum wage. All the things that we were doing that we thought all were the right things. But there was a bigger issue around child labor around the world, that because of our profile, not because of our size, because at the time we weren't that big of a company. We were only about a $3 billion global company. But we became the poster child for that issue. And it was a global issue. And it was in the early days of globalization, and we had to confront that. We really ignored it in fact, we fought it for the first probably 2 or 3 years, until we realized, hey, we're not going to win this fight if we fight it. We have to embrace this and turn ourselves into, a poster child for what it needs to look like, which we had a running head start because we were doing a lot of the right things, but we weren't talking about it. We weren't exposing people to it. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so we literally had to spend a lot more time and allocate a lot more resources to actually becoming, and it was one of the initial areas where we had to become much more transparent, which in today's world is common. I mean, it's a common theme. And 20 years ago when it happened, it was not. In fact, it felt very uncomfortable to put everything out there. And in today's world, if you don't put everything out there, you're just kidding yourself. You're gonna get in trouble. I would say those are off the top of my head, I could probably come up with 20 more, but those are three pretty big ones.
Yeah. Here, go ahead.
Thanks. Braden Evans, you talked about personal branding, and I was just curious about how you came up with the strategy for Air Jordan or other key figures like Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal. How'd you come up with that personal branding? Because when you look at other brands like Adidas, they adopted that as well. And so in my opinion, it seems like you guys came up with that personal branding strategy first. So could you just talk about the history of that and how you developed that?
Yeah, I think it all comes back again, and I keep going back, it stems from that relationship with the consumer. Well, it's that relationship with the consumer, and then what do they want to know about Michael Jordan or Roger Federer or Pete Sampras or Tiger Woods or, Gabby Reese or, whoever. And get to know the athlete. And then and if you talk to anybody who's been a Nike athlete of any consequence, they'll all say that they feel like they're part of the Nike family. And so there's a connection that we try and build and establish with the athlete that then gives us the access to them that the rest of the world doesn't see. And then what we try and do is amplify what makes them special or different. Because they're all individuals. I mean, they're all just people. And, whether it's Michael's, or Tiger's competitiveness or Kobe's. I mean, when I think of competitiveness, I think of Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, and Kobe Bryant above anybody and everybody else. I mean, they have another gear that just allows them to do things physically that everybody else is capable of doing, just not at that level of intensity. And then you think of, commitment and hard work, and guys like Roger Federer or Maria Sharapova. I mean, from the age of 13 as an example. I mean, she's phenomenal when you think about the kind of commitment that these people can make. So the idea was, and a great story is with LeBron, because we kind of took LeBron for granted early in his career. He was, obviously stood out, men among boys early in his career. We took advantage of him, I think. We didn't do our due diligence around really understanding LeBron as well as we could have and should have, which would have made LeBron a much more accessible personality than, and I think he's becoming that a little bit more today because of the things that he's had to do himself. He made the mistake about the way he went to Miami. He tried to correct that mistake when he came back to Cleveland. Those are all qualities. Those are real qualities for LeBron. I mean, he's a very unique athlete. He's probably the most team-oriented athlete I've ever seen in my life. He gets ridiculed for not scoring enough, or ridiculed for not, and people misplace some of that for lack of leadership. And it's not. And if you understand, I've known LeBron since he was 13. If you understand how he was brought up and the environment he was brought up in, he just wanted to be part of the group. He didn't want to be the guy. He didn't want to be he has this really, really deep desire to be a normal. He was always bigger than everybody else, stronger than everybody else, and all he wanted to be was everybody else. And you see that in the way he plays. I mean, he's a very team-oriented, and he's grown into this leadership role, which he's very comfortable with because he knows what he's supposed to be. But totally different personality than some of the other guys.
Thank you.
Okay, let's have a question way in the back there.
So a brand name like Nike comes with a certain list of consumer expectations. So what strategies does Nike use to continue to innovate and design new products without stretching outside the consumer's comfort zone?
Well, I think the first thing we do is we challenge the R&D groups to challenge the norm. So you have to start with going beyond the comfort zone of the consumer. There's a great quote by the original CEO of Sony that, the consumer doesn't know what's possible, we do. I think that's a great quote. The difference is when you do achieve something that the consumer thinks is impossible, the challenge then becomes, can we convince them that it is possible and that it is real? And some ideas come out before their time. The electric car is a great example. The electric car has been around for 30, 40 years. It just wasn't developed to the level that it is today and accepted today. Now there's different circumstances that allow it to be more embraced today than there were maybe 30 or 40 years ago. The concerns around fossil fuel limits, greenhouse gases, all the environmental issues that the fossil fuel consumption impacts. So I think, for us at Nike, the challenge is always innovate. But with that is the subset demand that change doesn't equal innovation. Just because you change something doesn't mean it's better. Innovation is only acceptable if it's better. And I think that's the main challenge, because a lot of times, when you have 650, 700 designers, they all feel like they have to design something. That's their job, right? And that's how they're incentivized, that's what they do, that's their core capability. And so I think the challenge is to get everybody not to just design for the sake of change, but design for the sake of improvement. And I think that it sounds simple. That's one of the biggest challenges for the R&D group. And then at the other end of the envelope, I was telling some of the guys that we were talking to earlier, you're going to be able to buy a pair of shoes in a very short period of time in relative to what time you guys have versus what time I have. But you're going to be able to customize a pair of shoes that you're going to stand on a plate. It's going to take a three-dimensional picture of your foot with a laser. It's going to feed it into a computer. You're going to design all the aesthetics. You're going to have a white shoe with a green swoosh and a blue outsole that has this type of cushioning technology and that type of upper, and literally you're going to push a button and a three-dimensional printer is going to create that product for you on site, eventually in basically a couple of minutes, and that's the way you're going to buy your footwear in the future. Now, you all go, wait a minute, I got to go to a shoe store, I got to go on my website, and I got to pick out what I like, and they're telling me, all that's going to go away because the technology is going to allow you to do all these things, and it exists today. It's just not, at a commercialization level where it's affordable. But they're making samples today like that, where it's all driven by some of the new emerging technologies, 3D printing, use of lasers, some of the new resins that are being developed. They're making airplane parts today with 3D printing. It completely changes the landscape of what the definition of manufacturing looks like. It's going to completely redefine what labor looks like. It's going to completely redefine, what job capacity and capabilities, are needed in a future state. But now, as a consumer, if I said that's without explaining anything, do you think that's possible? You're all going to go, yeah, that's the Jetsons cartoon. That's not going to happen. It's going to happen.
Well, I think we could be here for another 2-3 hours, but we've got to wrap it up. Dean Anderson.
Can I get the mic? Thanks very much, Charlie. It's wonderful to welcome you back here to Utah State. And
as you know, you're actually sitting on about 4 stories above the roof of Lund Hall, where you lived when you were here at Utah State University and a student athlete.
This is a nicer place.
It is nicer, and it really goes to the point about how much change there is in the world. You've been talking about this amazing ride that you've been on at Nike and how much change that involved. But I heard you this morning say that you actually think that the students today are facing opportunities that is a set of opportunities way beyond what you and I had the privilege of facing in our careers, and I really agree with that. But my question today, this is a leadership forum. You've spoken to a lot of different dimensions of leadership. We're now named after a great leader, John Huntsman, who exemplifies entrepreneurship and global vision and ethical choices and philanthropy and giving back, all those things that we strive to establish as part of the culture of this school now. And you worked for a guy who exemplifies many of those same things, Phil Knight. So my question is about Phil Knight and about his philanthropy. He is giving back in a major, major way to 2 institutions that shaped him. Just in the last, I think it's like a week or 2 weeks, it was announced that he's giving $500 million to the University of Oregon, and that's on top of what he's already done for Oregon. And I think his total giving to Stanford has been around $500 million too. Could you talk a little bit about what motivates Phil Knight to give back in this massive kind of way to the institutions that framed him?
Boy, I'll give you my perspective on it, because it's hard to. The one thing I've learned about Phil over the time I've had an opportunity to interact with him is he's pretty unpredictable, and I think one of his great personal assets, and I've always said this about him, is he has this innate ability to take disparate points of information and connect them in unique ways, and he's just blessed with that quality. He's because he'll always bring up something that he connects back to whatever we're talking about, and I'm not sure I would have thought about it that way, but it influences him quite a bit. There is a third area of philanthropy that he has committed to as well, which is he's made I think it was $1.5 billion grant to OHSU cancer research, and every one of his grants is challenged by a matching dollar. So he incentivizes the entity from which the grant is made by saying, I will match, up to, which for me is very, it doesn't surprise me a bit. In the sense that there's always a catch. Whenever he says something, there's always a catch. That inspires you to do more. And he's very consistent in that, whether it's in his giving or even in his leadership role. I mean, he never gave any direction without an expectation beyond where you thought the expected was. Which again was an empowering and somewhat intimidating tactic that he uses. But I think for him, and I've heard him talk about it, not a lot, but a little, because he's very private when it comes to this type of thing. And we always talk about, for years we've talked about, what the company should be doing. And we created a foundation and we invested, the company really invested. One of the things that we talked about was, because there's just an unending request for funding, which is understandable. But when you're Nike, you get it from every direction. I mean, you get it at the local level, you get it at the regional level, you get it at the global level, and trying to and we used to try and whitewash the landscape as best we could to just kind of make everybody happy and realized that we were spending lots and lots of money on stuff that really wasn't making a difference because it wasn't focused. And I think he adopted the same thing, the same realization that I can make some pretty good sized grants, or I can make a lot of nice sized grants. And I think what he's definitely decided is I'm going to make a difference, and he wants to make a difference. And so I think with all of his giving, he's attached his own set of desires within those. So if you use the most recent University of Oregon one, what he's said is they're going to build a facility that is focused on development of future technologies, whether it's through the sciences, not necessarily just business. But the other thing that he has placed on that grant is the requirement that it has to be in a collaborative environment. And so one of the prerequisites is it's to the University of Oregon, but as a starter, all of the higher education universities in the state have to have complete access to everything. And so because he's seen the benefits of collaboration. And so the whole premise from what I've seen on this particular grant is that it's built on this collaborative platform. And that is the commitment of the grant itself, which I think in today's world of academia is not a new concept, certainly, but it empowers it even more so, and it enhances that. And I think what Phil has seen through the lens of the company, it's a very collaborative environment. The company is a very collaborative environment, and he's seen the success that collaboration has developed or has provided in building the company. And then obviously the underpinnings of innovation and how it has served the company. So it's really an extension of his own philosophy, which makes sense. I mean, his personal success has been achieved from. So I think, he's got the 3 different units, and then the third component of that is his loyalty to where he's from and what he's done. I mean, he's been not real loud, but he doesn't have to be when he speaks. People listen. In the state of Oregon, has its challenges just like every other state, some of which we agree with, some of which we don't. But he's been very loud, I guess, around taxing entrepreneurial businesses and not allowing the entrepreneurialness to survive and succeed, and impinging too much of a burden from a tax-based standpoint on smaller businesses in the state, and he's been pretty loud about that. And then I think the cancer piece has been, he's been very, very specific around, the cancer research piece and the giving that he's done there, And then I think, he's the Stanford deal is really, he's known for all of his investments at Oregon around the athletics, which is where he participated athletically. He went to business school at Stanford, so all of the grants at Stanford have been towards the business school. So he's very loyal to the places that he's come from, and then he's been pretty focused. But why he's done what he's done, I'm not even going to go there. It would be unfair and somewhat illegitimate for me to reflect on that.
Great. Well, this was an amazing hour. Thank you, Charlie.
One more question from Jackson.
Yeah. Okay. So how do I do this? Do I state my name and everything?
You better make it quick.
Okay. Hey, I'm Jackson Denson. Who would be the top 3 people who you would attribute most of your success to, and what qualities about them made you do that or make that decision? Also, one of them had better be your wife, or she's going to be pretty upset.
It's a tough question.
Well, I was going to say you, your brother, and your mom.
Oh, wow.
Well, part of it, that's true. You, your brother, and your mom. Yeah. But that's a good question, Jackson. It's hard to, for me personally, and I think it's a personal thing. It's hard for anybody, well, it's hard for me to pinpoint anybody. I talk about my mom and my dad, you know, Jackson and his brother and his stepsister and his mom. And then, you know, people like Phil Knight and the incredible amount of people that I've had the opportunity to know and meet. I mean, you know, whether it's Michael Jordan or LeBron James, we talked about those guys, and I didn't get the chance to really know Prefontaine, but what he did and what he stood for. All those experiences go into creating, you know, the thing that's Charlie Denson. So, but I think for everybody, it's always good to find your mentors, but always leave a seat at the end of the bench, because you never know when that next mentor is going to come along. And I think, you know, keeping all of your options open and listening. Doug and I were talking about this before, but you know, this idea about diversity and diversity of thought is a very powerful concept, and one I really enjoy and embrace. And I think that idea about always listening to the next person, it can be distracting, and quite frankly, it can create points of indecision. But if it creates a point of indecision, then you need to listen to it, because you may not be as right as you think. And the idea that a great idea can come from anywhere. So that would be an answer to a pretty good question.
That's great. Thanks very much,
Yep.
Charlie.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.